Today we're talking about a story out of Mansfield, Connecticut, a haunting that took place back in 2005. Now this story was featured on the Sci-Fi Channel. It's legitimate. Down in the comments, I want you guys to tell me if you can find what doesn't belong and what does. The year was 2005, Mansfield, Connecticut. Now this is Misty Herbenston, and she was putting her son Bubba to bed. They'd moved into this house just 3 months prior. And aside from, birds inexplicably flying into the garage door and the occasional smell of rotting flesh that rose from the basement, things had been pretty normal during those first few weeks. Now Bubba was just a year old, and at the moment, he's asleep upstairs in his crib. It's 7 p.m. and the sun, it's going down. Now, Misty Herbenston-stein was downstairs when her husband came in through the front door. Now, he's a plumber by trade, and he'd been out working since 6 a.m. He asked how her day had been, and she told him it was fine. And then Bubba had gone to bed just 45 minutes earlier, so she asks him, "Hey, do you want a sandwich? I'm going to make you a sandwich. Have a sandwich." So he cracked a beer and slumped back into the recliner as the dog, Bartholomew, brought him the paper. Now, when Misty returned with the sandwich, he glared at her, looking just infuriated. He shouted, "I didn't want the crust. You know I hate the crust. You despicable, ugly hag." "I know." He then threw the sandwich to the dog, who caught it and promptly removed the bologna and wiped off the mayonnaise. And then as Misty begins to sob, it's her fault after all, her husband kicks back in the recliner and stretches, cracking a beer, and he burps and begins to mumble at her from under his breath. Now Bartholomew, the dog, who was naked, began to bark as the baby monitor crackled from its perch on the counter. Everyone turned to the monitor and listened. There was nothing to be heard for a few seconds until finally a dull hum of notes came through the static. And it was "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," and it sounded like as if it was coming from the crib itself. Now Misty looked at her husband, who was looking back at her, and she said, "What the heck was that?" And he said, "I don't know. What the heck was that?" She's like, "I don't know." So, like a good mother, she shrugged and returned to staring at the wall beside her. And this is what she mostly did. She thought of sourdough and gravity and how bird magnetism might work. She smiled as she imagined like her husband saying nice things and bringing her home chocolates. And after a few minutes, the monitor crackles again. But this time, the baby begins to cry. The music had stopped, and Bubba's screams just came through the ceiling. You could hear it everywhere. So she turns to the stairs, she glances at her fat husband in the recliner, and she thinks, "Oh my gosh, we were in love once." She thought of a time when suddenly came through the monitor in this hellish scream. So she turned and she bolted for the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, and she finally burst through the door as she rushed to the baby's crib. But nobody was standing beside it. The room was just empty. So she checked the window and the closet. She searched like the neighboring rooms under the bed, and still there was no explanation for the voice that she heard. And days went by, and still, whatever had happened there, it lingered in her mind. It was all she could think about. She'd make pancakes in the morning, and she'd mumble to herself, mindlessly thinking of the voice she'd heard. And still, in the end, she was forced to entertain the idea that it had only ever been like interference from another monitor next door. Never mind that her son's name is Bubba, and she probably lives in a town with 50 people. There's no one next door. But did she really believe that? Like, how could she? She knew what she'd heard. She was positive, deep down, that something was wrong with the house. And then, no, she thought. She tried to remember. It was something. What was it? It was when she first moved in. Man, she'd begun feeling this way 2 months earlier when, a tall black figure had scurried on all fours from the dark, galloping to the bottom steps of the basement. It looked up at her and moaned, then turned and collapsed into a pool of blood that evaporated into the dark with a ghostly vapor.
The light.
And then she tilted her head and she thought, wait, was that this house? She could feel her memory fading, you see. And all of this added up to the situation where she'd gone around, she'd hung religious ornaments on the wall and said prayers in the nursery upstairs ever since moving in. And before the inexplicable feeling that something was wrong with the home, it had been just her husband, and Bubba, the baby. But now, all of a sudden, her oldest son, Toby, arrives with his fiancée. And he's been laid off, and he needs some help getting on his feet. So he asks if he can move in with his parents. And naturally, his fiancée, she found this attractive in a man. And now, with all of them back in the house and finally under one roof again, Misty, the mother, took a moment to explain regarding the voice she'd heard a couple days earlier. She told him about the baby monitor. She told him about the strange sounds coming from Bubba's room, and that time the black embodiment of Satan had moaned at her suggestively from the bottom of the stairs. So Toby looked at his father, who was asleep in the recliner, and then the dog took his slippers off his feet, not with his mouth, but with his paws. And then that evening, the house was quiet as Toby and his fiancée slept on the couch downstairs. The television across from him was casting this dull glow until the sitcom they'd been watching suddenly skipped the static, buzzing quietly through the living room. And Bartholomew, the dog, he sits up and stares at the screen when suddenly the front door clicks open, slowly. And at this, the dog utters this low growl, defensively, looking into the dark outside. Upstairs, at the same time, Misty, she was in a deep sleep. She tossed and turned beside her husband, and she dreamed that she was a little girl, a child, locked inside a small, tattered room. There was a bed with handcuffs hanging from the metal bar alongside it, like a railing, and a single light bulb dangled from the ceiling on a chain. Around her stood adults, like full-grown people in white uniforms. They scolded at her, yelling and calling her this evil child. And she was filled with this anxiety and fear as everyone crowded around her, and she felt like they were going to kill her. And at this moment, she bolted toward the other side of the room, screaming as they clawed at her and chased her, and then she tripped, slapped her head against the wall, and then Misty woke up in bed, covered in sweat. And that had been the most realistic dream she'd ever experienced. She could still smell the carpet and the cigarette smoke lingering in the air. Her head still rang from smacking the wall, and as she looked around the room, she could still feel the presence of those towering people in the white uniforms, like standing beside her in the dark. Going downstairs to get a glass of milk to try to calm her nerves, she found the front door open and the dog growling at the darkness outside. So she closed the door, turned off the television, the static, and rubbed Bartholomew's ears. He kissed her gently with his lips. The dog sat down on the recliner like a person, and opening the fridge, she withdrew the jug of milk and placed it on the counter. She turned to the cupboard for a glass when she suddenly heard the plastic jug expanding and kind of creaking. She turned as the gallon began to inflate, finally resulting in the lid popping off, exploding, and milk boiled out the top and pooled along the counter, dripping onto the floor as she screamed to her son to come quickly, come into the kitchen right now. And her son said that it must have just been expired. You know, that happens when you leave milk out for too long. Kind of, for days in the sun, maybe. At any rate, the next day, she was at the American Eagles saloon. This is a woman who's married and has a baby at home. She's married to an idiot for sure, but like she's at a saloon, at the bar. I mean, according to the Sci-Fi Channel, that's what's happening. And she found herself sitting beside an old, bearded man named Tad. And he said, "Hey, you own the old house down the end of the road, right?" "Yeah, that's right. You know what that place used to be, don't you?" And she said, "No." And he went on to explain that from 1860 to 1993, the home had served as the Mansfield Training Academy, better known as the House of Imbeciles. And in 1917, it had merged with the Connecticut Colony for Epileptics and was officially named the Mansfield Training School and Hospital. So it was a place to send emotionally and physically stunted people with Down syndrome, and probably unfairly alongside them, the criminally insane. And she suddenly reflected on her dream, the staff, the hospital bed, the handcuffs. Suddenly it all made sense. And she recalled that when they'd first moved in, the wheelchairs, the bloodied rags, and the tattered sign downstairs in the basement that was propped up against the wall that read Mansfield Training School, All the puzzle pieces suddenly came together, when before it had been a goofy mystery cocooned in an unsolvable enigma. And then Tad, the old man next to her, tried to kiss her, and she slapped him across the face. And then back at the house, hours later, she descended into the basement with her son. Her husband followed, carrying Bubba in his arms, and she had a sack of shovels and hammers over her shoulder. She threw them down onto the concrete floor, because there was this unnatural concrete square that rose up out of the ground. It was about 4 feet by 4 feet wide, and from the concrete it was on, it rose about 1/4 of an inch. And she was increasingly sure that if she just dug this up, she would be able to prove once and for all that her dream had been not a dream, that she was channeling one of the children, one of the victims of this hospital, that it hadn't been all in her head, that those children had been killed in this home, and that those doctors had buried the evidence down here in the basement. Now, she'd been hacking away at the corners with her shovel, trying to make some progress on this, and meanwhile, her son, he'd picked up a hammer, and he was going to work on the other side. And as they pried up chunks of rock, her husband shined his light at the dirt beneath the rubble and gasped, dropping the baby. Bartholomew, the dog, caught the baby with his arms and placed him gently on the ground beside the stairs. And then Misty, she dug through the debris and just stared at the burnt chunks scattered among the rocks. These were charred bones, and she was sure of it. She picked up a small, broken piece of skull and began to cry. That had been her. That had been the child in her dream. Months later, her son, he'd get a job and he'd move out. Her husband would have a stroke and lose the use of his legs, and Misty, appropriately, took the opportunity to put some space between the two of them, opting to move his cot down to the basement so he could sleep more comfortably at night. And beyond that, there's not a lot to the story. I don't know what came of this. Of course, a couple of things don't quite add up here. All of this, every aspect of it, is completely true. I was kidding at the beginning. It's all real. I defy you to find something in this story that doesn't make any sense. And that's it. Thank you for being here. Please subscribe, share it with your friends, and tell people about this channel. It's brand new, and I'm trying to grow. And be a good dog. Like Bartholomew.